The room was colder than the marble walls that caged it. 100 eyes fixed on the long bench above, where authority sat draped in black robes. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that hums just before a storm. And then his voice cut through it. Calm, measured, and dripping with disdain, asterisk perhaps, Justice Clarence Thomas said, leaning ever so slightly forward. The Congresswoman should revisit basic legal principles before lecturing the court, asterisk for a second. Time fractured. Pens froze midair. Cameras whirred to life. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to die, afraid to interrupt what had just happened. Somewhere in the back row, an aide's breath caught audibly, a tiny sound swallowed by the sudden silence. Across the room, Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her eyes didn't narrow. Her hands didn't flinch. Instead, she let the insult hang there, suspended like smoke, until it began to suffocate its source. The corner of her mouth twitched, not in anger, but in recognition. She'd heard this tone before. The quiet condescension of men who mistook longevity for wisdom, power for truth. Her calm was unnerving. Even Thomas shifted slightly, sensing that his words hadn't landed the way he expected. The camera zoomed in, one capturing the faint reflection of her composed face on the polished table. Another caught the ripple of discomfort crossing the audience. The room's energy had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. A reporter whispered, "Did he really just?" And the question fizzled before finding an answer. Because everyone knew. He did. Crockett leaned forward, her voice low but unshaken. "Justice Thomas," she said, the syllables soft as silk but edged with iron. "With all due respect." A heartbeat. 1, 2. The tension coiled tighter. She paused, letting the echo of his arrogance fill the silence. Her gaze didn't waver. Behind her, aides waited, eyes wide, breath shallow. Somewhere, a light flickered, casting both their faces into sharp relief, the old guard and the new conscience of America, locked in a single frame. And in that suspended moment, every person watching knew instinctively something was about to break. What she said next would echo through every corner of Washington. Asterisk, by the time the hearing broke for recess, the tremor from that single exchange was already rippling beyond the courtroom walls. Inside, it had been just another moment, sharp, uncomfortable, but brief. Outside, it was already turning into a storm. Reporters dashed into hallways, phones pressed to their ears, voices rising. "Did you hear what Thomas just said?" Clips surfaced within minutes. The remark, "Revisit basic legal principles," looped on a dozen feeds, cut against Crockett's unflinching stare. No shouting, no grand theatrics, just that look. It was enough to ignite a conversation that America had been avoiding for years. Who truly gets to define intelligence, and who merely gets to perform it? By sunset, talk shows picked it up. One commentator smirked. She got schooled by a Supreme Court justice, while another fired back. Or maybe the justice just exposed his own bias. That's how it began, a national tug-of-war, not over a ruling, but over respect. In living rooms and online forums, viewers debated what had really happened in that room. Some saw arrogance disguised as authority. Others saw a challenge to the invisible hierarchy that so often silences new voices, especially voices that look like hers. Race, gender, generational power. Every fault line in American discourse had been touched, however briefly, by that single phrase. And beneath the noise, something subtler was stirring. People began revisiting Crockett's record, her years as a public defender, her calm in chaos, her refusal to yield. This wasn't just a politician caught in a viral moment. It was a woman who had spent her life walking into rooms designed to doubt her. Every clip sentence, every raised eyebrow she'd ever endured, this was all familiar terrain. But now the battlefield was national. Late-night hosts joked about it. Hashtags flared. Hashtag basic legal principles trended first in Washington, then across the country. Some used it ironically, others as a rallying cry. One viral post read, "When a man with power underestimates you, make him remember your name." It was liked by over 1 million people in 24 hours. Meanwhile, newsrooms scrambled to contextualize the moment. Analysts dissected Thomas's words frame by frame, debating intent versus implication. Commentators noted the imbalance: a lifetime appointee speaking down to an elected representative, a man whose voice had shaped legal precedent, versus a woman still fighting to be heard in committee hearings. And yet, the true weight of the moment wasn't in what he said, but in how she hadn't responded. That silence, that pause, it was strategy. It was history repeating itself in reverse. Restraint as rebellion, composure as confrontation. By morning, the narrative had split. Some conservative outlets framed it as a lesson in humility. Progressive circles, however, saw something else entirely. They saw a reckoning. They saw an old order trembling under the gaze of a woman who refused to flinch. Then came the question that none of them could answer: what would she say next? Reporters camped outside the Capitol, pundits teased exclusives, and millions of viewers refreshed their feeds waiting for a single clip, a single quote. The hearing wasn't even over, but the internet had already chosen sides. Because this wasn't just about legal principles anymore. It was about perception, power, pride, and the quiet revolution of being underestimated one too many times. The next round of that hearing wouldn't just decide who was right about a statute. It would decide who owned the narrative of truth itself. And when Jasmine Crockett finally opened her mouth again, America would find out exactly who understood the law and who only pretended to. Asterisk for more than 3 decades. Clarence Thomas had sat atop the nation's highest bench like an immovable shadow, rarely speaking, rarely shifting, a monument to quiet authority. His silence had become legend. In the courtroom, where questions could carve history, he often asked none. Colleagues called it discipline. Critics called it detachment. To him, it was control, the kind that demands attention without ever needing to earn it. His story began far from marble halls. Born in the Deep South, raised under the weight of segregation, his rise should have been a story of resilience and hope. And for a time, it was. But somewhere along the ascent, empathy hardened into armor. He learned that survival in a system built on hierarchy meant mimicking the coldness of its architects. By the time he reached the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas had turned distance into a philosophy. He believed emotion clouded reason, and that the law, pure and unyielding, was the only truth worth serving. But purity has a price. It can turn conviction into blindness. It can convince even the sharpest mind that understanding and compassion are forms of weakness. For years, his silence insulated him from scrutiny. He was a figure carved from granite, his expression unreadable, his rulings decisive. The public saw what he wanted them to see, an intellect untouched by the noise of politics. Yet beneath that stillness, controversy simmered like a dormant fault line. Ethics questions, financial ties, political whispers, each one dismissed as irrelevant, each one reinforcing the image of a man beyond accountability. He'd survived scandals that might have crushed others. The secret to his endurance wasn't innocence, it was detachment. The more the world questioned him, the less he cared to answer. To some, that made him powerful. To others, dangerous. Because power without dialogue becomes something else entirely. It becomes monarchy dressed in judicial robes. Inside chambers, aides whispered of his precision, his meticulous control over words, his disdain for small talk. Every interaction was deliberate, every pause rehearsed. He spoke not to persuade, but to remind. Remind others of hierarchy, of tenure, of untouchable intellect. Even fellow justices sometimes avoided confrontation. His glare could turn a debate into silence. And so, over decades, the myth grew. Clarence Thomas, the impenetrable mind, the man too wise to explain himself, the judge too elevated to be questioned. It was a myth he'd come to believe, but myths, like marble, crack with time. The nation was changing. The deference once given to power was fading, replaced by a restless demand for transparency. Younger lawmakers, many of them women, many of them people of color, were beginning to ask what had long gone unasked. Who holds the powerful accountable when the powerful believe themselves above reproach? Thomas didn't notice the shift at first. Or maybe he did and chose not to care. The certainty of his own legacy made him unflinching, perhaps even bored by dissent. He'd watched generations of politicians rise and fall, watch the news cycle chew through outrage and forget it by morning. To him, every critic was temporary. He was permanent. Until that afternoon. The congressional hearing was supposed to be routine, a symbolic exercise. A show of oversight without consequence. He'd done it before countless times. He expected reverence, or at least restraint. But Jasmine Crockett's presence changed the equation. She wasn't deferential. She wasn't timid. And most dangerously, she wasn't impressed. Her questions didn't aim to flatter. They aimed to expose. When he interrupted her, that familiar arrogance flickered, born not from malice, but habit. He'd done it so often to so many that it no longer registered as condescension. It was instinct. Authority reaffirming itself. Yet in that moment, something imperceptible shifted. Cameras caught it. The old aura of untouchability faltered for just a second, replaced by something almost human: defensiveness. A judge who had outlasted every scandal suddenly found himself facing a challenge. That couldn't be ignored, because it wasn't about corruption or ideology. It was about respect. And respect, unlike power, cannot be demanded. As the headlines swirled and pundits dissected the remark, Thomas likely told himself it was nothing, a brief clash, soon to be forgotten. But arrogance has a way of creating its own courtroom. The kind where public opinion becomes the jury and silence, once his greatest weapon, becomes his loudest mistake. What he didn't yet know was that this time, the verdict wouldn't come from the marble halls of Washington. It would come from the millions watching beyond them, waiting to see whether the old guard could still stand when finally someone looked them in the eye and refused to bow. Asterisk long before she ever walked the marble corridors of Congress, Jasmine Crockett learned what it meant to stand alone in a room where power didn't expect her to exist. The accent, the hair, the unapologetic tone, all of it had been used against her more times than she could count. But for her, those weren't weaknesses. They were proof. Proof that she could endure, and that endurance, not entitlement, was the truest form of strength. She grew up in Texas heat, the kind that burns through excuses. Her father worked long shifts, her mother stitched together side jobs to keep the lights on. They didn't have much, but they had faith in hard work, and speaking up, and never letting silence be mistaken for consent. From an early age, Jasmine understood that justice wasn't a gift you received. It was a battle you fought every single day, often for people the system forgot. Law school had been her first battlefield. Professors questioned her tone, her classmates questioned her focus. "You're too emotional," they'd say. "You'll burn out." But emotion wasn't her flaw, it was her fuel. She didn't want to memorize law. She wanted to wield it. While others practiced courtroom theory, she practiced composure, learning to smile while being underestimated, to respond with precision when someone expected to stumble. Her first real job was as a public defender in Dallas County, a position most young lawyers treated like a temporary stop. But she stayed. She stayed through the late nights, the tearful families, the clients no one wanted to represent, men accused of crimes they didn't understand, women who signed confessions they couldn't read. Every case taught her something about the machinery of injustice, how it grinds down those without resources, without pedigree, without patience for formality. In those courtrooms, insults came dressed as advice. Judges called her young lady. Opposing counsel smirked when she spoke. She learned to keep her posture steady even as their words clawed at her credibility. Sometimes she won, sometimes she didn't, but every loss carved a deeper understanding of what power really looked like and what it feared most. Composure. One night, after a particularly grueling case, an older colleague told her, "You've got heart, Crockett, but heart won't survive in the system." She smiled then, not because he was wrong, but because she already knew the truth he didn't. The system was never built for her survival. It was built to test it. Years passed. Her reputation grew not for charm, but for tenacity. She became known as the lawyer who wouldn't fold. Reporters began showing up to her hearings. Activists called her the fighter with poise. She hated the nickname, it made strength sound accidental. Like grace was a lucky accessory rather than a weapon she'd sharpened out of necessity. By the time she ran for public office, she had already seen what broken justice looked like from the inside. Campaign advisors warned her she was to direct, that she'd be labeled angry. She didn't care. She wasn't angry, she was awake. And America, she believed, needed to wake up with her. Her speeches weren't polished. They were raw, rhythmic, born from the same fire that had kept her standing in 1,000 small rooms, where no one thought she belonged. She spoke about equality like it was personal because it was. She talked about fairness not as a concept, but as a memory stolen from too many people she'd represented. Her rise wasn't meteoric. It was methodical, brick by brick, case by case, step by step. When she arrived in Washington, the halls didn't intimidate her. She'd been stared down by worse men in smaller rooms. She'd been underestimated before, and she had learned to turn that underestimation into oxygen. Every dismissive glance only reminded her why she was there, to speak for those whose silence had been demanded for generations. The first time she sat across from a federal judge, she noticed something familiar in his eyes, the same polite superiority she'd seen her entire career. It didn't faze her. She had learned that arrogance often hides insecurity, that condescension is just fear trying to look respectable. And when she heard the same tone from Justice Thomas that day, the same careful dismissal wrapped in formality, she didn't flinch. She recognized it instantly. Because Jasmine Crockett had spent her life confronting men who believed power was a birthright. She had learned that when they say, "You don't understand the law," what they really mean is, "You understand it too well." The path that led her here wasn't lined with applause. It was built from the echoes of every courtroom where she'd been talked over, every hallway where her credentials were second-guessed, every headline that called her outspoken when they meant unapologetic. So, when Clarence Thomas's remark echoed through that hearing room, condescending, confident, absolute, it didn't wound her. It reminded her of every client she defended, every insult she'd absorbed, every fight she'd already won by simply refusing to bend. And that's exactly why she wouldn't flinch when a Supreme Court legend tried to belittle her. Asterisk, asterisk, the hearing resumed with an almost ceremonial calm, the kind that hides its own tension. Reporters had returned to their seats, murmurs rippled through the chamber like static. and Clarence Thomas sat unmoved chin high, eyes narrowed just enough to signal that he was ready to reassert control. The earlier moment, he seemed to believe, had been a brief flicker of insolence, soon to be corrected by the steady hand of experience. He cleared his throat before speaking, a sound rehearsed and deliberate. "Congresswoman," he began, his tone deceptively polite. "This court operates under traditions older than any of us in this room. Perhaps familiarity with that history might lend better context to your concerns." It wasn't the words themselves, it was the weight beneath them, the kind of subtle dismissal that had kept the powerful comfortable for centuries. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. Her hands were still, folded loosely in front of her, her voice calm when she replied, "Respectfully, Justice, context is only useful if everyone in history had a seat at the table." The chamber stirred. It wasn't loud, but it was noticeable, like wind sneaking through a crack. Thomas tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing further. "Our legal traditions," he countered, "are what separate order from chaos. Emotion, politics, even passion, none of it should outweigh the sanctity of reason." Crockett leaned forward just slightly, not challenging the hierarchy, but bending it toward her. "And yet," she said, her tone measured, "reason has too often been defined by those insulated from its consequences." For the first time, Thomas hesitated, only for a heartbeat, but enough for the cameras to catch it. The exchange was no longer lecture versus student, it was to ideologies colliding in real time. Inherited authority versus earned perspective. He adjusted his glasses, voice firmer now. "Congresswoman, this isn't a courtroom for rhetoric. We deal in law, not theatrics." Her eyes met his, unwavering. "I agree," she said softly. "That's why it matters who gets to write the script." A few spectators exchanged glances. Somewhere, a stifled laugh broke the tension before dying under a glare from the bench. The energy had shifted subtly, dangerously. Thomas exhaled through his nose, leaning back. "I appreciate your enthusiasm," he said. The word enthusiasm laced with all the patronizing calm of a man convinced he'd regained ground. "But the integrity of this institution depends on decorum. Passion is admirable, but it must know its place." Crockett tilted her head slightly, as though studying an artifact behind glass. Her reply was almost a whisper, but it carried through the chamber. "With all due respect, Justice, I'm not sure integrity and silence belong in the same sentence." It was surgical, precise, the kind of line that could only come from someone who trained her composure into a weapon. He blinked just once. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Around them, the air grew heavy again, every ear tuned to the invisible string between them. Thomas tried to steer the discussion back to procedure, but his words stumbled, losing their practiced rhythm. He spoke of decorum, jurisdiction, respect for precedent, but with every phrase, his certainty seemed to shrink. Each carefully chosen word now sounded defensive. Crockett didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Her restraint had become the argument. Her calm wasn't silence, it was defiance disguised as discipline. By now, even the cameras seemed to lean closer. You could feel it, the turn, the unspoken realization that this wasn't a reprimand anymore, it was a reckoning. And when she finally did speak again, her tone was so controlled it was almost disarming. "Justice Thomas," she began, "you've served this nation for decades. You know better than anyone that the law evolves or it withers. And sometimes evolution looks a lot like accountability." The last word landed with the weight of a gavel. No one moved. Not the aides, not the press, not even Thomas. The silence was electric, a live wire stretched across the chamber. And for the first time that day, it wasn't clear who was in control of the room anymore. Then, in one measured breath, she flipped the courtroom dynamic. The silence lingered so long it began a pulse, heartbeat against marble. Camera clicks like distant thunder. The hearing room had turned into a pressure chamber, thick with the anticipation of something irreversible. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her gaze locked on Clarence Thomas. Every eye in the room followed the line of sight between them. Every breath waited for her next move. She began slowly, her voice soft but deliberate. "With all due respect, Justice Thomas," she said, and that phrase, so often a cushion for surrender, sounded instead like a warning. "You've spoken about the sanctity of law, the discipline of precedent, the restraint that defines judicial integrity. I'd like to remind you of something you once wrote." Her words hung there. Thomas's expression didn't change, but his fingers twitched just once on the armrest. Crockett unfolded a sheet of paper, the soft rustles slicing through the quiet. She didn't look at it. She already knew the quote. "In 1995, you said, and I quote, 'When power is unchecked, it inevitably forgets the people it was meant to serve.'" A ripple moved through the gallery. Journalists lifted their cameras. Aides glanced at one another. Crockett continued, her tone tightening just enough to signal precision, not aggression. "Today, Justice, we sit in a chamber designed to check power. Congress and the court, the two branches meant to keep each other honest. Yet when one side calls the other ignorant for demanding transparency, what does that make of your own principle? Thomas's jaw shifted, his lips pressing into a thin line. The light above caught the faint sheen of sweat near his temple. Crockett didn't press forward. She let silence work for her. Every pause was a scalpel, not a gap. Respectfully, sir, she said again. It's not ignorance to ask who funds the shadows behind the bench. It's democracy doing its job. Somewhere in the press row, a phone vibrated. Someone whispered, "She's quoting his own opinion." Crockett moved on, voice steady, unwavering. You warned of judicial activism once. But what's more activist than ruling on cases tied to your own benefactors? You spoke of moral clarity, yet the public sees ethics disclosures vanish like smoke. So tell me, Justice, when did moral clarity become conditional? Gasps? Audible. The kind of sharp, collective intake that no longer belonged to one person, it belonged to history. Being written in real time. Thomas shifted, his hand moving toward his microphone, but he hesitated. The moment was no longer his to command. The camera zoomed in, catching every flicker of discomfort, every micro-expression he couldn't conceal. Crockett pressed on, but never raised her voice. She didn't need to. You've sat in silence for decades on that bench, she said. And maybe silence is strength, or maybe it's comfort. But out there, she gestured faintly toward the door, toward the unseen millions, silence is struggle. It's mothers waiting for justice, families crushed by rulings that forgot their faces. Her words carried the cadence of testimony, not debate. The cadence of truth turned poetic by conviction. I've stood beside people who couldn't afford lawyers, who were told their pain didn't fit the law's definition of harm. I've seen what happens when the system tells them to wait for fairness from men who've never waited for anything. She paused again. The room felt smaller now, the air denser. Even Thomas didn't look away. And yet, she continued, softer, almost reflective. You once wrote that equal justice is the promise that keeps America from breaking apart. I still believe that. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm speaking. Not to disrespect this court, but to remind it of its own words. The silence that followed wasn't just absence of sound, it was reverence. Every journalist's fingers hovered over keyboards, unsure whether to type or just watch. Thomas finally leaned toward his mic. His voice, when it came, was lower than before. Congresswoman, but she didn't let him finish, not rudely, but with the kind of grace that reclaims authority without asking permission. Justice Thomas, you've given this nation decades of jurisprudence, she said. You've shaped the architecture of law. But law without accountability is just architecture, beautiful, cold, and hollow. That line detonated. It wasn't loud, but it landed. The crowd's murmur rose a crescendo of disbelief, awe, and approval. Even the stenographer's fingers faltered for half a second. Thomas blinked, slowly. His face betrayed no emotion, but his silence said everything. For the first time in his career, the man who preferred to let others fill the air had been rendered wordless by his own record. Crockett leaned back slightly, the calm of someone who'd made her case and didn't need to overstate it. The microphones captured the faint hum of tension before the first shutter snapped. One, then another. Then a storm camera flashes firing like lightning across the chamber. The sound built into rhythm, click, 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 as if history itself was taking notes. Then came the tweets. Phones lit up in the audience. Crockett just quoted Clarence Thomas to his face. She brought receipts. This is a masterclass in composure. Within seconds, the moment had escaped the room and was multiplying across feeds. Timelines, headlines. Crockett gathered her papers. Movements deliberate. Decorum matters, she said, eyes still on Thomas. But so does honesty. And if we're going to talk about who understands the law, maybe it starts with who still remembers why it was written. That last sentence hung in the air like smoke. You could almost feel the gravity shift, how the crowd, the cameras, even the marble walls seemed to recognize what had just happened. Thomas's expression hardened, but something in his eyes flickered just for a fraction of a second. Not defeat, not even anger. Something quieter. Maybe the dawning realization that his authority had met its equal, not in rank but in resolve. And then nothing. Just that suspended stillness before the applause that no one dared to begin. The chair of the committee cleared their throat, a soft attempt to restore order. But the energy in the room had already changed. What was meant to be a reprimand had become revelation. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't grandstand. She simply gathered her things, her gaze still calm, her tone still respectful. The kind of dignity that doesn't need victory to prove itself. Outside the chamber, reporters would rush to file stories, pundits would dissect every word, and millions would replay that clip again and again, the exact moment when power blinked out inside. Though it was still, only the echo of her voice remained. And in that silence, one truth was unmistakable: dignity had just outshone condescension. Asterisk. The moment Jasmine Crockett gathered her notes and walked out of that chamber, the story had already escaped her control. It was no longer a congressional hearing, it was a cultural earthquake. Within minutes, the clip hit social media like a spark in a drought. The words "law without accountability is just architecture beautiful, cold, and hollow" were replaying in endless loops across millions of screens. By the end of the first hour, hashtags were erupting. Hashtag Crockett vs. Thomas. Hashtag Lego mic drip. Hashtag respectfully revolutionary. Twitter no. The entire internet was aflame with debate. Cable news anchors scrambled mid-broadcast to splice in the footage. The lower third banner screamed, "Crockett confronts Supreme Court power," and Justice Thomas left speechless. CNN analysts called it a defining moment in congressional composure. On Fox, panelists fumed about grandstanding and disrespect. MSNBC hosts leaned forward, eyes gleaming, calling it the calmest takedown in modern political history. But beyond the polished studios and pundit panels, something deeper was stirring. A law student at Howard University posted a short clip of herself tearing up while watching the exchange. "Greater than I've been told to tone it down in every mock trial. Today, I saw what tone with truth looks like." An older veteran tweeted from his hospital bed, "Greater than I've served under flags, judges, and presidents. But I've never seen someone defend democracy with that kind of grace." In Houston, a teacher replayed the moment for her civics class. The student sat stunned, then erupted in applause. "She didn't just talk back," one said. "She stood up without standing down." By nightfall, Crockett's expression serene, unflinching, had become a meme, an icon, a screensaver of self-control. Someone remixed the footage into a cinematic montage titled "The Lower Members," set to a swelling orchestral score. Within 12 hours, it hit 2 million views. On TikTok, creators narrated the showdown like it was a Marvel battle scene. "That was the moment," one said, "when the courtroom turned into a mirror, and power finally saw itself." Meanwhile, conservative commentators scrambled to reframe it. It was performative, one insisted, on air, a political stunt. But the counter-replies came fast, stitched to the clip itself. Performative? No. That's what integrity looks like when it finally gets the microphone. The digital wildfire burned through every platform. Articles bloomed with headlines. "Crockett quotes Thomas to Thomas. When decorum meets truth, a new voice for accountability." Even late-night hosts joined in. One joked, "Justice Thomas thought he was giving a lecture, he got a master class instead." Laughter. Applause. But beneath the humor, something had shifted in tone. The laughter wasn't mockery. It was relief. By the next morning, the Washington Post published an op-ed titled, "The Power of Respectful Defiance." It described Crockett's composure as a case study in reclaiming civic dignity. The author concluded, "When democracy is bruised, sometimes all it needs is someone who refuses to raise their voice but still raises the standard." Across America, watch parties formed organically. College debate teams dissected her pacing. Church groups streamed the clip as part of Sunday discussions on humility and courage. It wasn't just politics anymore, it was pedagogy, performance, and principle fused into one viral moment. And yet, amid all the celebration, Crockett herself remained mostly silent. No press conferences, no victory laps. Just one short statement posted to her account, "Greater than when we speak truth with composure." It echoes longer than any insult ever could. That post alone gathered 3 million likes in a day. In the swirl of digital chaos, one thing became clear. She hadn't just confronted a justice, she had restored a sense of justice. People feared was gone. It was no longer about left or right, decorum or defiance. It was about who still believed that dignity could win in a shouting match world. In barbershops, college dorms, veterans' halls, and kitchen tables, her words became shorthand for standing your ground. Parents told their daughters, "That's how you fight back with calm fire." Professors told their students, "That's what it means to cite, not shout." But as the hashtags reached peak virality and the nation debated whether the exchange would alter the legacy of a sitting justice, something quieter lingered just beneath the noise, a realization no trending topic could capture. Because the real victory wasn't online. It wasn't in the retweets or the headlines or the parodies. It was in the simple, steady image of a woman who refused to be small in the face of power. A woman who spoke softly and shook marble. And as the feeds kept refreshing and the pundits kept talking, the truth began to surface. This wasn't about who won the argument. It was about who reminded America that arguments still matter. But the real victory wasn't digital, it was moral. Asterisk. When the echoes of that hearing finally faded, something remarkable remained: not the sting of confrontation, not the noise of partisanship, but the quiet aftershock of dignity. The kind that doesn't demand applause, doesn't chase validation, but settles deep into the conscience of a nation still deciding who it wants to be. Because in that room, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just debated a Supreme Court justice, she had drawn a line between arrogance and integrity, between the authority that demands silence and the courage that earns respect. Her words didn't wound, they revealed. Her composure didn't weaken her argument, it was the argument. That's the thing about dignity. It isn't loud. It doesn't perform. It endures. And when arrogance stands before it, time itself takes sides. Clarence Thomas represented a kind of power. America knows too well the power that hides behind tradition, mistaking longevity for legitimacy. The kind of authority that expects deference, not dialogue. But Crockett reminded the country that reverence without accountability is not respect, it's submission. And democracy doesn't survive on submission. It survives on courage. In every great American story, there's a moment when the powerful mistake quiet for weakness, and every time, the quiet proves stronger. Rosa Parks didn't raise her voice. Neither did Fred Korematsu in his Courtroom, nor Ruth Bader Ginsburg in Dissent. Their calm wasn't compliance. It was conviction. Crockett's moment was born of that lineage, a reminder that silence, when chosen, can thunder louder than shouting. As the headlines began to fade and the next political storm brewed, something subtle but important had shifted. Across classrooms, workplaces, and kitchen tables, people began to see themselves in her steadiness. Immigrants who'd been told to wait their turn. Women who'd been talked over in meetings. Young lawyers warned to smile more, speak less. They watched and thought, that's how you hold your ground without losing your grace. Because grace isn't surrender, it's strength under control. Thomas may have had the title, the robe, the years of jurisprudence. But that day, Crockett carried something rarer, moral credibility. The kind you can't appoint or inherit. The kind that can't be stripped by ridicule or rank. And in that difference lies the moral heartbeat of this story. Power can silence microphones. It can stall hearings, rewrite rules, even erase names from history books. But it cannot command respect. Respect is earned in the moments when one person, armed with nothing but truth, stands tall before those who forgot why they rose in the first place. Crockett didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for every person who has been underestimated, dismissed, or told that their calm made them small. Her words were a mirror forcing the nation to ask, who really understands the law, the one who memorizes it, or the one who still believes it belongs to the people? As the story settled into memory, the marble halls went quiet again. But beneath that stillness was a hum of conversation, of introspection, of hope. Because for a brief, crystalline moment, America remembered what integrity looked like when it refused to bow. And perhaps that's the lesson this era needed most, not that might makes right, or that cleverness wins debates, but that truth, carried with humility, outlasts every insult. When arrogance fades, dignity remains. When noise dies down, composure echoes. And somewhere deep in the American spirit, in the place where courage and conscience meet, those echoes remind us that democracy doesn't need to shout to survive. It just needs someone willing to stand up, stay calm, and speak the truth anyway. The image lingers long after the headlines fade, the steady gaze of Jasmine Crockett, facing down a legacy of arrogance. In that single frame, the story of the day crystallized. Power met composure, and composure did not blink. It's a moment that reminds us that greatness isn't measured by title, tenure, or tone, it's measured by truth. Because this wasn't just a clash between a congresswoman and a justice. It was a collision between two versions of America, the one that hides behind status, and the one that still believes courage can speak softly and still shake marble walls. As the chamber lights dimmed and the echo of her final words settled into the air, the message grew larger than the moment. Respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. And in that truth, every viewer found a piece of their own story, the student finding their voice, the worker standing up to unfairness, the citizen still believing that democracy belongs to all of us. So if you believe dignity should always outweigh ego, if you believe the calm truth will always stand taller than loud power, share this story. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to see that composure can still conquer condescension. In a world that rewards outrage, be the person who chooses integrity. In an age of noise, remember the quiet power of courage. This was more than a debate, it was a reminder that America's promise isn't preserved by those who shout the loudest, but by those who refuse to lose their grace when challenged. The music swells, the flag reflects in the glass, and as the screen fades to black, the message remains: dignity is strength. Share it forward.